The forest was calm, with only the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind breaking the silence. The air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar comfort to Rusty, the ginger cat. He was perched on a large moss-covered rock in the heart of Manila National Forest in West Virginia. His amber eyes narrowed as he surveyed the clearing below, his fur catching the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. Rusty was a seasoned survivor. He had lived most of his life as a solitary cat, wandering the woods, surviving on his own. This part of the forest, bordering the small town of Havenwood, was his territory. He knew every nook and cranny, every hidden burrow, and every place where picnickers might carelessly leave scraps. He had learned to be patient, to wait until the humans were gone before he ventured out to scavenge what was left behind. The day before, the clearing had been alive with the sounds of laughter and the aroma of grilling meat. Havenwood's annual summer picnic had taken place, and Rusty had watched from a distance. His eyes narrowed as he calculated the potential for leftovers. It was a rare opportunity, and he had learned over the years to be patient. He would wait until the humans left before claiming his share. Now, all that remained of the picnic were flattened patches of grass, discarded paper plates, and napkins fluttering in the breeze. Rusty hopped down from the rock, his movements fluid and silent. He sniffed around the edge of the clearing, his whiskers twitching. He found a half-eaten hot dog bun, a few stray potato chips, and a small piece of fried chicken. It wasn't much, but it would do. He devoured the food quickly, his hunger momentarily satisfied. As he prepared to leave and explore another part of his territory, he heard something. A faint whimper, soft but persistent, came from the deeper woods beyond the clearing. Rusty paused, his ears pricked. It was the sound of an animal in distress. He hesitated. His first instinct was to ignore it. Survival in the wild demanded self-reliance, and he had no time for weaklings. But the whimpering continued, growing more desperate. A flicker of curiosity stirred inside him, and against his better judgment, he decided to investigate. Moving cautiously, his body low to the ground, Rusty entered the thick undergrowth. His nose twitched as the scent of the young animal grew stronger. It was a dog, and a young one at that. Rusty rounded a thicket of rhododendrons and froze. There, tangled in a thorny vine, was a German shepherd puppy no more than a few months old. Its coat, meant to be a rich black and tan, was matted with mud and leaves. Its eyes were wide with fear and confusion, and it struggled weakly, its whimpers turning into yelps of pain as the thorns dug into its skin. Rusty watched the puppy for a moment, his expression unreadable. He could walk away, leave the puppy to fend for itself. It wasn't his concern, but something about the puppy's vulnerability tugged at him. Perhaps it was the way the puppy looked at him, a mixture of fear and pleading, or maybe it was the flicker of memory from his own kittenhood. Long before he had become the hardened survivor he was today, he couldn't explain it, but he couldn't just leave the puppy to suffer. Rusty approached the puppy cautiously, making a soft chirping sound, a sound he hadn't used since he was a kitten. The puppy stopped struggling and looked at him, its tail giving a tentative wag. Rusty gently nudged the vine away from the puppy's leg, using his paw to untangle it. The puppy yelped again, but it seemed to understand that Rusty was trying to help. Once the puppy was free, it collapsed onto the ground, exhausted. It licked Rusty's paw tentatively, a gesture of gratitude. Rusty recoiled slightly, unused to such displays of affection. But the puppy seemed sincere, and for a moment, Rusty felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Looking around, Rusty saw no sign of the puppy's owner. There was no scent of humans nearby. The puppy had clearly been lost for some time. The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air grew colder. The puppy shivered, pressing itself against Rusty's side. Despite his usual preference for solitude, Rusty didn't move away. He felt the puppy's thin body trembling, heard its soft, whimpering breaths. He knew the puppy wouldn't survive the night alone. He looked back toward the clearing, toward the faint lights of Havenwood in the distance. The dangers of the human world were numerous: cars, unfriendly dogs, and people who didn't like stray cats. But the puppy had no chance in the wilderness. A decision formed in Rusty's mind, one that surprised even him. He would lead the puppy toward the town, toward the possibility of help. It was a risk, but one he was unexpectedly willing to take. Rusty started walking, moving slowly toward the edge of the woods. The puppy, weak and limping, struggled to keep up. Rusty paused frequently, waiting for the puppy to catch its breath. The night was filled with the sounds of the forest, the hooting of owls, the rustling of leaves, and the distant howl of a coyote. The puppy whimpered, pressing closer to Rusty's side. For the first time in a long time, Rusty felt a sense of responsibility, a burden he hadn't asked for, but one he couldn't ignore. The wilderness had thrown them together, a mismatched pair, bound by a shared need for survival. And in that moment, Rusty realized that despite his hardened exterior, he was not as alone as he had once thought. The morning sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting pale rays onto the forest floor. Rusty awoke stiff and hungry, his body aching from the night spent curled on the ground beside the puppy. He glanced at the small German shepherd, still asleep, its body curled up in a tight ball for warmth. Its breathing was shallow, uneven, a sign that the puppy wasn't out of danger yet. The night had been long, and the cold had seeped into Rusty's bones, but he couldn't afford to rest. The puppy's survival depended on him, and the longer they stayed in the woods, the weaker the puppy would become. Rusty nudged the puppy gently with his paw, rousing it from its sleep. The puppy stirred, blinking its bleary eyes, and let out a weak whine. Its legs were shaky as it tried to stand, but it collapsed back onto the ground with a soft whimper. Rusty sighed, his patience already wearing thin. He had no time for hesitation. They needed to keep moving. The world outside the woods was dangerous, and it was a race against time. Rusty stood and began walking toward the direction they had traveled the previous night, towards the edge of the forest in the distant town of Havenwood. The puppy struggled to its feet once more, its legs trembling with exhaustion, but it followed Rusty as best it could. Every few steps, the puppy stumbled and collapsed onto the ground, its energy all but spent. Rusty's patience was stretched thin, but he couldn't abandon the pup, not now. "Come on," Rusty muttered softly, though he knew the puppy couldn't understand him. "We need to keep moving." The journey through the underbrush was slow and grueling. Rusty was agile, quick on his feet, easily navigating the thick foliage, while the puppy lagged behind, tripping over fallen branches and rocks. It was clear that the pup was getting weaker, its body already worn down from the hardships it had faced. Rusty paused frequently, waiting for the puppy to catch up, his amber eyes scanning their surroundings for any signs of danger or food. Hunger gnawed at Rusty's stomach, and his instincts urged him to hunt, to find something to satisfy the hunger that had been growing ever since the picnic scraps had run out. His senses sharpened, and his ears twitched at the faintest sound, a rustle in the undergrowth. Rusty's gaze flicked to the movement, and he darted forward, silent as a shadow. A mouse darted through the leaves, its small body quick and nimble. Rusty gave chase, his movements swift and precise, and in moments the mouse was caught in his jaws. He killed it quickly, its small bones crunching between his teeth. As he ate, his eyes flicked toward the puppy, who was watching him hungrily, its tail wagging weakly. Rusty hesitated. He hadn't planned on sharing his food, but the puppy was starving, and he couldn't ignore its pleading gaze. He nudged the remaining portion of the mouse toward the puppy, and after a moment's hesitation, the puppy eagerly devoured it. Its tail wagged slightly in gratitude. Rusty's stomach growled again, and he licked his lips, finishing the last of the mouse. But his mind was still preoccupied with the task ahead. The puppy needed food, but it needed more than that. It needed proper care, and the only place to find that was in Havenwood. The trek continued. Rusty and the puppy moved slowly through the forest, the weight of the journey pressing down on them both. The puppy's pace had slowed to a crawl, and its body was trembling with exhaustion. Rusty knew that if they didn't find help soon, the puppy wouldn't survive. By the time they reached the small creek Rusty had remembered, it was already afternoon. The sun had moved high in the sky, and the air was growing warmer. The small creek was little more than a trickle, but it was enough to provide them with the water they needed. Rusty lapped at the cool liquid, feeling it soothe his dry throat. The puppy drank greedily, its entire body shaking as it drank from the creek, trying to quench its thirst. They rested by the water for a while, the puppy dozing fitfully beside Rusty. The sound of the creek was soothing, but the weight of their situation was far from forgotten. They were close to the town now, and Rusty knew the dangers that awaited them. Cars, unfriendly dogs, and hostile humans could all be threats to them. He needed to be cautious, especially with the puppy's weak condition. As they continued their journey, the forest began to thin. The trees were fewer, replaced by open fields that stretched out toward the distant town. Rusty's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the landscape. He could see the rooftops of houses on the outskirts of Havenwood. The scent of wood smoke and cooking food drifted on the breeze, making Rusty's stomach growl with longing. The closer they got to the town, the more nervous Rusty became. They had entered the more populated outskirts of Havenwood, and the risks of exposure were higher. Cars roared along nearby roads, and the sounds of humans filled the air. Rusty kept to the edge of the fields, using the tall grass for cover. The puppy, however, was oblivious to the danger. It stumbled along beside Rusty, its energy completely spent. Then out of nowhere, a car sped past on the nearby road. The loud roar of its engine startled the puppy, and it yelped in terror. It pressed itself against Rusty's side, shivering with fear. Rusty hissed, his fur bristling with tension. They had to move quickly, but the puppy was too weak to run. Rusty nudged it forward, urging it to move faster. They were almost there, just a few hundred yards from the first houses on the outskirts of Havenwood. But the puppy's legs were giving out. Its pace had slowed to a crawl, and it was barely able to keep up. Rusty's patience was running thin, but he couldn't abandon the puppy now. He saw a small, overgrown garden behind one of the houses and made a snap decision. It would have to do. Rusty led the puppy toward the garden, his body tense with caution. The puppy limped along behind him, its legs shaking with exhaustion. When they reached the gap in the hedge that separated the garden from the street, Rusty pushed through, urging the puppy to follow. They collapsed into the tall grass, hidden from view. Rusty took a moment to catch his breath, his eyes darting to the surroundings, always alert. The puppy was lying beside him, breathing heavily, its tail thumping weakly against the ground. Rusty knew that this was only a temporary refuge. They couldn't stay here forever, but for now it was enough. The puppy was safe for the moment, and as the sun began to set, Rusty couldn't help but wonder what would come next. He had made it this far, but the journey was far from over. The next morning brought little relief. Rusty's sleep had been fitful, his mind weighed down with the responsibility of keeping the puppy safe. As the sun filtered through the overgrown garden, he stretched his legs and yawned, his body still stiff from the journey. He glanced down at the puppy, which was curled up next to him, still fast asleep. Its breathing had steadied somewhat during the night, but it still looked fragile, its ribs visible under its thin coat. Rusty's stomach growled in protest. The last meal he had eaten was the small mouse from yesterday, and he was eager to find food, both for himself and for the puppy. But first he had to assess their situation. The garden was quiet, hidden from the view of the road, but it wouldn't be long before someone noticed the stray dog and the cat lingering near the house. The puppy stirred beside him, its eyes fluttering open. It blinked at Rusty, then looked around, confused. It whimpered softly, trying to rise to its feet, but its legs buckled, and it collapsed back into the grass. Rusty watched with a mixture of impatience and concern, his usual detachment fading slightly as he observed the puppy's struggle. "We need to move," Rusty murmured, though he knew the puppy couldn't understand him. "But we can't stay here long." He began to get up, stretching his limbs before turning back to the puppy. Rusty padded over to the small animal, nudging it gently with his paw. The puppy whined again, its body trembling as it struggled to stand. Rusty sighed, his patience thinning. But there was no time to waste. The puppy had come this far, and it wasn't about to give up now. With a soft chirp, Rusty nudged the puppy again. This time, the puppy managed to push itself up, its legs shaky but determined. Slowly it followed Rusty, its body trembling with every step. Rusty led the puppy through the garden, slipping out through the hedge that separated it from the street. He moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The quiet neighborhood of Havenwood stretched before them, the scent of wood smoke and the distant hum of life in the town filling the air. The world beyond the garden was still new and unsettling for the puppy, but Rusty had lived his entire life in these woods, had survived through the worst the wild had to offer. He wasn't used to trusting humans, but there had been something in the elderly woman's eyes, Sarah's eyes, that made him think she might be their best chance. As Rusty padded along the sidewalk, his tail low and his ears alert, he spotted a few houses in the distance. One of them had a small flower garden out front, and Rusty couldn't help but notice the faint scent of food wafting from the direction of the house. It was coming from the house with the elderly woman he had seen the day before, the one who had given them both milk. His stomach growled again, but the nagging sense of caution held him back. He needed to be sure the puppy was strong enough to continue, and he also needed to ensure they weren't walking into danger. He paused near the corner of the street, scanning the surroundings before looking back at the puppy, who was now struggling to keep up. Rusty hesitated for a moment before turning back to the garden. The puppy was nearly exhausted, and he didn't want to push it too hard. He sighed and sat down next to the puppy, deciding to wait for a little while, keeping watch over the house. The morning passed in relative silence. Sarah's house was quiet, except for the occasional flutter of movement in the window, a sign that she was still inside. Rusty's thoughts were occupied by the puppy's condition. They had to keep moving, but where could they go? The puppy needed care, but Rusty didn't know if he could trust anyone else to take care of it. Then just as he was about to stand up again, he heard a faint voice. A soft, melodic hum was drifting through the open window of Sarah's house. It was the woman from the day before, Sarah. She was singing a gentle tune, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the melody. Rusty hesitated, a strange tug in his chest as he listened. There was something comforting about the sound. The puppy, too, seemed to be drawn in by the gentle hum. It tilted its head, its ears perking up at the sound. Then slowly, the puppy dragged itself to its feet, its tail wagging weakly as it shuffled closer to the window. Rusty, feeling a flicker of something unfamiliar, followed cautiously, watching the puppy's every movement. The door to the house opened, and Sarah appeared, carrying a small bowl in her hands. She looked down at the puppy, her expression softening as she bent down. "Well, hello there," she said, her voice kind and soothing. "You must be hungry." Rusty watched from the shadows of the bushes, his amber eyes narrowed. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to remain hidden, but something inside him held him there. The puppy had made its way towards Sarah, its tail wagging despite its exhaustion. The elderly woman smiled at the puppy, bending down to place the bowl of food before it. She spoke gently, her voice filled with warmth. "I'm glad you found your way here," she said. "You've had quite an adventure, haven't you?" Rusty's fur bristled at the sight. He wasn't used to this kind of kindness. He had lived alone for so long, surviving by his own instincts, relying on no one but himself. Yet seeing the puppy eat eagerly from Sarah's bowl and watching her stroke its fur so gently, he felt something shift within him. It was an emotion he hadn't expected, a deep, unexpected ache, a longing for something he had long since given up on. For a moment he considered leaving. He had led the puppy to safety. Maybe it was time to slip away and continue his solitary life in the woods. But something stopped him. He stayed where he was, hidden in the shadows, watching as the puppy ate and Sarah gently tended to it. Finally, as the puppy finished eating and curled up by the door to rest, Sarah glanced around. Her eyes scanned the yard, and for a fleeting moment, they met Rusty's amber gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet understanding, as if she knew he was watching. Rusty hesitated, his instincts telling him to flee, but he stayed in place. It wasn't until Sarah had returned inside the house, the door closing softly behind her, that he stood and padded cautiously toward the porch. His paws were silent on the gravel as he made his way toward the small bowl she had left out for him. When he reached the bowl, he paused, his nose twitching as he sniffed the food. It was tuna, fresh and appetizing. He glanced toward the house, his sharp eyes catching the faint silhouette of Sarah in the window, but he couldn't see her clearly. He had made it this far, and he didn't know if he could trust her completely, but she had fed the puppy, and that meant something. With a final glance at the house, Rusty lapped at the food in the bowl, his stomach growling with gratitude. The comfort of a full belly was fleeting, but it brought him a moment of peace. As he finished, Rusty turned back to the garden. He had made a decision. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the risks were great. But for the first time in a long time, Rusty felt the stirrings of hope. He could feel it deep within his bones, the possibility of something better for him and the puppy. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to stop running. The days following the decision were a mixture of uncertainty and cautious optimism. Rusty had never been one to rely on others, but something had changed in him. There was a bond, however fragile, between him and the puppy, now named Shep by Sarah, and it was one he couldn't ignore. It wasn't simply survival anymore. It was responsibility. Rusty found himself growing accustomed to the small comforts of Sarah's yard, the warm meals she left out for him, the gentle hum of her presence, the faint sounds of the town in the distance. These things were new to him, but he remained cautious. He knew better than to let his guard down. The woods had taught him the harsh realities of life, and although he found a strange comfort in Sarah's care for Shep, he knew it couldn't last forever. One way or another, he would have to return to his solitary existence. Still, the days passed, and as Shep grew stronger, Rusty grew less sure of his next step. The puppy's health had improved remarkably under Sarah's care. His coat had begun to regain its shine, and the sadness in his eyes had slowly been replaced with a spark of playful energy. He was no longer the helpless creature Rusty had found in the woods. Shep was becoming the puppy he was meant to be, a lively, energetic soul with a future ahead of him. Rusty couldn't help but watch, observing the bond forming between Shep and Sarah. There were moments when he wondered what life could be like if he allowed himself to trust, to settle into a life where he wasn't alone. But those moments were fleeting, and Rusty quickly pushed them away. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Rusty sat in the corner of the garden, his amber eyes fixed on the door to Sarah's house. He had watched Shep and Sarah interact for days now, and the puppy's attachment to the elderly woman was undeniable. Shep followed her everywhere, his tail wagging as he tried to keep up with her every movement. Rusty could see it, the warmth, the affection, the way Shep had bonded with Sarah as though she were his rightful owner. It was something Rusty could never have imagined for himself, but it didn't belong to him. It belonged to Shep. The puppy needed Sarah, and he needed a home where he could run and play, not a life of uncertainty in the woods. The thought stirred something inside Rusty, something he had long since buried, regret perhaps, or even a longing for companionship. He wasn't sure, but it didn't matter. He was a survivor, and survivors didn't get attached. Rusty turned his attention away from the house as he heard footsteps approaching. He tensed instinctively, his ears pricking. It was Sarah carrying a small bowl of food for him. As usual, she set the bowl down on the porch, a kind gesture of goodwill. "Here you go, Rusty," Sarah called softly, her voice carrying with a gentleness that had become familiar to him. "I thought you might be hungry." Rusty hesitated for a moment, his eyes fixed on her. She was still the stranger in his world, despite the care she had shown him. He had always trusted no one. But Sarah's voice, so kind and warm, made him feel a strange sense of comfort. He patted toward the bowl slowly, never taking his eyes off her. As he reached it, he could see that Shep was nearby, curled up on the porch, his eyes half closed as he watched them both. There was a slight twitch of Shep's tail when he saw Rusty approach. He seemed to be watching with the same curiosity that Rusty had grown accustomed to. The puppy had already claimed a space in Sarah's life, and there was a quiet, unspoken understanding between them. Rusty took a few tentative bites of the food. It was tuna again, something he wasn't used to, but it was satisfying nonetheless. The stillness of the evening settled around them, and for a moment, Rusty found himself wondering if he could really leave this behind. Could he return to his solitary existence in the woods, knowing what he had witnessed, the warmth of companionship, the healing that came from kindness? It wasn't just Shep who had changed. Rusty had changed too. The raw edges of his hardened independence had been smoothed by the unexpected bond he had formed with the puppy. He had been a loner for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to belong, to feel like he was part of something. As Rusty ate, Sarah sat quietly on the porch, watching them both. Shep had perked up at the sight of her, and now he was sitting beside her, resting his head on her knee. The puppy looked up at Sarah with an expression of pure affection, his eyes filled with trust. And Rusty simply watched, feeling an odd sense of longing. For a long time neither spoke. The air was cool, the quiet night settling in around them. It wasn't until Sarah spoke again that Rusty's attention snapped back to her. "I've been thinking about you, Rusty," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with the same warmth she had always offered. "I can tell you're not like the other cats I've known. You're different." Rusty paused, his whiskers twitching in surprise. He didn't know what to make of that. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him like that, like he was more than just a stray, more than a survivor. There was something in her voice that told him she saw him for what he was. Not just a cat, but a creature capable of change, capable of something more. "I don't expect you to stay," Sarah continued, her eyes meeting his, "but I can see that you've taken care of Shep, and I want you to know that you're welcome here. If you want to stay, you have a place." Rusty looked at her, his amber eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt, any hint of insincerity. But there was nothing. Sarah was speaking from the heart, and for the first time in his life, Rusty felt the weight of a decision that wasn't about survival. It wasn't about what he could take from the world. It was about what he could give. The puppy looked up at Rusty, his eyes still full of trust, his tail wagging faintly. And in that moment, Rusty realized something important. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was part of something, something bigger than himself. With a sigh, Rusty finished the food in his bowl. The hunger in his stomach was satisfied, but there was still a gnawing emptiness inside, a feeling that he couldn't quite name. He looked back at Sarah, who was still watching him quietly, a gentle smile on her face. Then he turned to Shep, who was now lying at Sarah's feet, his eyes closed in contentment. Rusty's heart ached with the weight of his decision, but for the first time, it wasn't a burden. It was a choice. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop being the cat who ran alone. The decision wasn't easy, but as he looked out at the quiet garden, with Shep by his side and Sarah's presence offering an unexpected comfort, Rusty realized that this unlikely trio, cat, puppy, and woman, had found something rare, an alliance forged through hardship, strengthened by kindness. And for once, Rusty allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a new beginning. The days following Rusty's quiet decision were filled with a strange, tentative calm. For the first time in a long while, Rusty found himself lingering in Sarah's garden, not out of necessity, but because he felt a pull toward the warmth and safety it offered. He no longer sat just on the outskirts, watching from the shadows. He began to spend more time in the open, his paws resting on the porch, his amber eyes lazily scanning the horizon. It was as if the weight of constant survival had lifted, if only a little. Sarah had noticed the change, though she didn't comment on it directly. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. She continued to care for Rusty, leaving out food for him every morning and evening, always making sure there was enough for both him and Shep. Shep, of course, had become more playful each day, his energy returning as the days grew warmer. He was running through the yard, chasing butterflies, or lying contentedly by Sarah's side as she went about her day. The bond between the puppy and Sarah had deepened, and Rusty had to admit that there was something incredibly comforting about the way they had come to rely on each other. Yet despite the puppy's progress, Rusty still couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't quite belong here. The world had always been his. The woods, the open fields, the wild, those were the places he knew. Even if he had decided to stay, he wasn't sure how to truly become part of Sarah's world. He was a survivor, not someone who had ever thought of creating a life with others. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Rusty sat perched on the porch, watching Shep bound about the yard, his energy infectious. The puppy would run from one corner to the next, pausing only to nuzzle Rusty in between, an endearing habit that made Rusty feel oddly protective of the little creature. He was beginning to feel an unfamiliar softness in his heart, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to indulge in for years. "Rusty," Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She was standing near the edge of the porch, her hand on the doorframe as she looked down at him. Come inside, it's getting chilly. Rusty blinked, his fur prickling with surprise. He hadn't expected the invitation, and for a moment his instinct told him to retreat, to remain in his safe, familiar spot outside. But something stopped him. Something about the warmth of Sarah's offer, her gentle voice, and the puppy's tail wagging as it bounded toward the door, made him pause. He rose slowly, his body stiff from his usual watchfulness. He padded towards Sarah, his paws quiet against the wooden steps. When he reached the door, Sarah opened it wider and stepped aside to let him in. It was a small gesture, but to Rusty it felt significant. Inside, the house was warm. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and there was a comforting presence in every corner. Soft rugs lined the floors, and the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner filled the silence. It wasn't the cold, empty silence of the woods. It was the kind of silence that came from peace, from belonging. Shep, who had followed them inside, immediately trotted over to a soft rug by the fireplace, curling up in a ball to rest. Rusty lingered near the door, unsure of where to go or what to do. The space felt foreign, yet inviting. He could feel the pull of the fire in the hearth, the warmth radiating from it, but he hesitated, unsure of how to settle in this space. "I know you're not used to this," Sarah said gently, her voice filled with understanding. "But you're welcome here, Rusty. You don't have to be alone anymore, if you don't want to be." Her words were simple, but they struck a chord deep inside him. Rusty turned his amber eyes toward her, his usual guarded expression softening just slightly. He had always been alone. It was what he knew. But the softness in Sarah's voice made him question that solitary existence. Was it possible to share his life, even just a little? Was it possible to belong to something more than just the wild? He padded closer to the fire, the warmth enveloping him, and stretched out on the rug near Shep. The puppy lifted its head and wagged its tail in greeting, nuzzling against him briefly before settling back into a relaxed position. Rusty felt the pull to stay, the heat of the fire on his fur, the soft glow of the room, and the peaceful quiet. He had never realized how much he needed these things until now. Sarah sat in her armchair, knitting quietly. She glanced up at Rusty, and for a moment their eyes met. She didn't say anything. There was no need to. In the stillness of the room, Rusty felt a sense of belonging that he had never experienced. He had been so used to survival, so used to keeping his distance from others. But in that moment, he realized how much he had longed for something more. He had allowed himself to become distant, to build walls around himself. But now those walls seemed to crumble, piece by piece. The evening passed slowly, and Rusty settled deeper into the warmth of the room. Shep had fallen asleep by the fire, his head resting on his paws. Sarah continued knitting, her movements rhythmic and soothing. Rusty closed his eyes, his muscles relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. He was content, something he hadn't been in a long while. As the night stretched on, Rusty found himself falling into a comfortable doze. For the first time in a long while, he felt no need to be alert, no need to be vigilant. He was safe. He was no longer alone. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the room besides the steady rhythm of Sarah's knitting. And for the first time in years, Rusty allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he had found a place where he belonged. The door was still open for him to leave if he chose. He could still return to the wild. But as he lay there, nestled near the fire, with Shep by his side and Sarah in the room, he knew that the world he had known was shifting. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful. Rusty closed his eyes fully for the first time since arriving in Havenwood. He would stay. For now he would stay, and maybe in time, he would learn what it meant to truly belong. Weeks passed, and the seasons began to change in Havenwood. The days grew shorter, and the crisp autumn air carried with it the scent of fallen leaves and distant smoke from chimneys. The once lush, green garden surrounding Sarah's house began to show signs of the coming winter, but it was still alive with color. Bright orange marigolds and purple asters mixed with the deep greens of the evergreens. Rusty had come to appreciate these small changes, something he had never really noticed before in his solitary life. Now, with the world around him quieter and more peaceful, he took solace in these everyday sights. Rusty had settled into a routine. Each morning, Sarah would prepare breakfast, and he would eat with Shep, both of them sitting side by side in the warmth of the kitchen. It was simple food, canned tuna for Rusty, and kibble mixed with some scraps from Sarah's own meals for Shep. But it was nourishing, and it filled the void in a way that Rusty had never known. Shep, with his newfound energy, had become a source of constant motion. The puppy would race around the yard, his tail wagging as he leaped over fallen logs, bounded after butterflies, and even attempted to dig holes in the flower beds. Sometimes Rusty would watch from the window, his amber eyes softening as he observed Shep's playful antics. He could see the joy in the puppy's eyes, the kind of carefree happiness that was foreign to him. Rusty had never known that kind of joy, not the kind that came with running without worry or resting without fear. It wasn't that Rusty didn't enjoy the days he spent at Sarah's house. He did. The warmth, the company, the routine, it all felt new and unfamiliar, but he was slowly growing accustomed to it. At night, he would curl up near the fire, his body sinking into the soft rug, the heat of the flames licking at his fur. And sometimes when Sarah sat in her chair by the hearth, knitting quietly, she would reach over and gently stroke his fur. Rusty would flinch slightly at first, unused to such attention, but over time he had come to appreciate the touch. It wasn't invasive or demanding, it was simply kind. He found himself growing fond of Sarah, something he had never expected. There was something in the way she cared for both him and Shep, how she made sure they were well fed, how she spoke to them with such tenderness, how she never expected anything in return. It was a kind of love he had never known, not from the humans he had encountered in the past. She didn't want anything from him. She simply wanted to care for him, to offer him a home. But despite this growing sense of attachment, Rusty's independent nature still clung to him. He had never been a pet, never someone who had been taken care of. The wilderness had taught him to be self-reliant, to take only what he needed and nothing more. And as much as he appreciated Sarah's kindness, there were moments when the weight of dependence pressed on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't quite fitting into this life, that he wasn't meant to be here forever. His instinct to roam, to explore, to be free, it never left him. One cool afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Rusty found himself perched on the windowsill, gazing out at the thickening shadows in the yard. The trees were bare now, their leaves scattered across the ground, and the scent of the woods filled the air. It was a familiar scent, one that tugged at his soul, reminding him of the life he had left behind. Shep trotted up beside him, nudging Rusty gently with his nose. The puppy's tail was wagging furiously, and there was a bright, innocent curiosity in his eyes. Rusty turned to look at him, and for a moment, the puppy's unguarded affection reminded him of the bond they had formed. The two of them, an unlikely pair, had come a long way since their days in the woods. "You're getting strong, little one," Rusty murmured, though Shep couldn't understand him. The puppy's tail wagged harder at the sound of his voice, and Rusty felt a stir of affection for him. The bond between them was undeniable. They had survived together against all odds, and that shared history would always be a part of them. As Shep continued to wag his tail and nuzzle Rusty, Sarah walked into the room. She smiled softly when she saw them both together, her heart swelling with affection. She had grown attached to Rusty, and though she knew the cat's independence wouldn't allow him to be fully tamed, she had come to see him as part of her family, just as Shep had become part of it. "Rusty," she said gently, her voice filled with warmth, "you're welcome here, you know. I hope you know that by now." Rusty looked up at her, his amber eyes narrowing slightly. She had said those words before, but hearing them again felt different now. He had been living with Sarah for some time, and he couldn't deny that his heart had softened. Still, there was something inside him that longed for the freedom of the open woods. He didn't belong here in this quiet, domestic life. "I know," he replied, his voice a soft rumble. His tail flicked, a sign that he was beginning to relax in her presence, but his mind was still unsettled. "But I can't stay forever. You know I'm not made for this." Sarah's expression softened, and she nodded. "I know," she said, her voice gentle but understanding. I've known that from the beginning, but I want you to know, Rusty, that you have a place here, if you ever need it. The words were simple, but they held a weight that Rusty couldn't ignore. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't just a stray cat anymore. He wasn't alone. He had found a home, even if it was one he didn't entirely understand. Shep nudged him again, this time with more urgency, as if trying to tell him that life didn't have to be so complicated. Life, for the puppy, was simple. Run, play, sleep, love, repeat. Rusty envied Shep's ability to give in to the warmth of his surroundings so easily, to accept love without hesitation. "I can't stay," Rusty said softly, though there was a trace of uncertainty in his voice. "But I'll never forget what you've given me. Both of you." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Take your time, Rusty. The door's always open. And Shep," she smiled down at the puppy, "he'll always be here for you." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Rusty stayed by the window for a long time, looking out at the darkening forest, his heart torn between the life he had known and the life that was now before him. He wasn't ready to give up the wilderness, not yet, but he knew deep down that this strange new life with Sarah and Shep had touched him in ways he hadn't expected. The night fell, and Rusty joined Shep by the fire, curling up next to the puppy. For the first time, he allowed himself to relax, the warmth of the fire seeping into his bones, the quiet rhythm of the house lulling him into peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, it was enough to be here, with Shep, with Sarah, and with a home that didn't require him to be alone anymore. And for that, Rusty was grateful. As the days grew colder and winter began to settle in over Havenwood, Rusty's life had changed in ways he could never have anticipated. He had arrived in the small town as a lone survivor, a scruffy stray who had learned to rely only on himself. The woods had been his world, and his existence had been defined by independence, by the harsh realities of survival. But now, as he lay in front of the fire with Shep curled up beside him, his life was different. It was quieter, warmer, and filled with the gentle rhythms of everyday life. Sarah had continued to care for both him and Shep with kindness that was as unyielding as it was surprising. She had never expected anything in return, never asked for anything. Her home, once empty and quiet since her husband's passing, now felt full. The simple act of welcoming Rusty into her life had brought a warmth she hadn't realized she was missing. Rusty had come to understand the value of these small moments. For the first time in his life, he had experienced a sense of belonging. It wasn't the hard, solitary existence of the wild. It wasn't the world of scavenging and moving from place to place. It was a world of compassion and connection. He could feel Shep's constant presence, the puppy's loyalty, and even the quiet bond he shared with Sarah. It was a different kind of survival, a kind that had nothing to do with being alone or always fighting for the next meal. The decision to stay, though, wasn't an easy one. The pull of the wild, the call of freedom, was still there. It was in the crisp wind that blew through the trees outside, in the scent of the forest that lingered in the air. Rusty had never been one to settle, never been one to put down roots. But slowly, as the days passed and the winter deepened, he realized something profound. Survival doesn't always mean being alone. There was strength in connection, in sharing the burden of life with others. Rusty had spent so long fighting, so long running from the possibility of vulnerability, that he had forgotten what it was like to trust. To allow someone else to care for him, without fear, without hesitation. It wasn't weakness to be part of something. It was strength, of a different kind. One evening, as Sarah prepared dinner and Shep lay on the rug by the fire, Rusty sat in his usual spot near the window. He watched the snow begin to fall softly outside, covering the ground in a thick blanket of white. The world was quiet. The world was still. And for the first time, Rusty understood that being still didn't mean he was missing out on anything. It didn't mean he had to go back to the woods, to the endless chase for survival. His heart, once hardened by the need to survive, had opened in ways he had never thought possible. And while he knew he wasn't the same cat who had wandered the woods of Havenwood months ago, he had found peace. Peace in the company of Shep, peace in the warmth of Sarah's home, peace in the simple act of belonging. The lesson from Rusty's journey. Rusty's story is a reminder that sometimes the hardest thing is not to survive, but to allow ourselves to belong. In a world that often celebrates independence, self-reliance, and solitude, we may forget that there is strength in connection. The wild teaches us how to fend for ourselves, how to be tough, how to survive. But the world also offers something equally vital: the power of kindness, the warmth of a community, and the comfort of knowing that we are not alone. Rusty's journey is about the balance between independence and connection, about the realization that no matter how much we fight to stand alone, there is something deeply transformative in accepting the help, the care, and the love of others. It's easy to be afraid of vulnerability, to fear that dependence on others makes us weak. But in truth, it takes more strength to trust, to open our hearts, and to let others care for us than it does to push them away. In the end, Rusty's greatest lesson wasn't that survival was a solitary endeavor. It was that survival in its truest form includes the capacity to love and be loved. Whether in the warmth of a fire, the companionship of a playful puppy, or the quiet care of a kind woman, Rusty found the greatest strength was in the connections he had formed. He learned that life was not just about surviving, but about living, about sharing that life with others, opening up to the possibility of belonging. And so, with Shep by his side and Sarah's gentle care surrounding him, Rusty discovered that home was not just a place. It was the people, the connections, and the quiet moments of peace that made life worth living. And for the first time in a long time, Rusty understood that sometimes the greatest strength lies in the ability to stay and to belong.